In this episode of Expat Experts, we have a truly remarkable guest with us, Dr. Scott Allen, a recognized physician on the field of health and human rights whose early career took him to the front lines of the Cambodian refugee crisis in Thailand. We'll be discussing his experience as an expat during these difficult times, and later in the episode, we'll delve into his current work addressing healthcare challenges in US prisons and immigration detention centers.
This is Expat Experts, the podcast that dives into the fascinating lives of those who've lived and worked across borders, exploring the challenges, experiences, and insights they've gained along the way.
But before we dive into today's episode, I want to remind to all our listeners that the way to stay tuned with the latest content and episodes is by hitting subscribe in YouTube and your favorite audio platform. For more insights and exclusive one-on-one calls on how to create your own podcast, YouTube channel, or navigate the expat life, please visit our website expatexpertspodcast.com or check the link in the description.
The Expat, Scott Allen.
In this part of the episode of The Expat, I would like to, thank you again for accepting the invitation to be in the podcast, Scott. It's really incredible. I'm happy
Pleasure
to have
be
you here. It has been some years when you lived abroad, but I think it's a very relevant experience what you lived in Thailand, and I think we can dig a little bit deeper in this first part into what happened, what motivated you to go there. You actually, I think you wrote a book recently about it, also about the experience around there. We can, of course, talk about the book itself also later. I think you have it behind you.
Yes, I do.
So yeah, without further ado, I would say we can start with this first part of the episode.
Sure.
What initially motivated you to leave your home country, United States, and moving to such complex situation like a refugee crisis in another country? What was the motivation behind that?
Well, it's a great first question. Yes, it took me a book length to answer it adequately in the memoir I just published, Across a Bridge of Fire. But the short answer is that I was burned in an accident at age 10, about a third of my body affected by third-degree burns. And in short, that experience and my recovery in a burn hospital in Boston, a pediatric burn hospital, changed the way I looked at the world. So that by the time I was in my teens, 17 to be specific, and the news of the world was focusing on the Cambodian refugees hitting the border, I just felt an overpowering urge to do something. And I had no illusions that I had any skills. I knew I had nothing to offer, but I felt I just had to be there. So such began a very unlikely journey of running away from home, getting a one-way ticket, and getting myself to Thailand. And miraculously was able to get work initially as a relief worker. And within months, I was working with the U.S. Embassy. So it's a sort of uncommon beginning of a journey, but it changed my life.
Can imagine, of course. Like it's surprising also how something so early in your life can mark you. Like if from age 10 until 17, you are 7 years in there that you've lived here, you had your kind of difficult experience, let's say like this, for an early age, and that marked you and motivated you to help others.
Yes,
which I suppose it also marked the rest of your career afterwards also, because you became a physician, a doctor, and that didn't end in Thailand, helping people.
Correct. It is all clearly related. It all is a journey. And I don't, even though my story, I think, is fairly unique, but I don't think that aspect is atypical at all. I think we, in some way or another, we're all sort of reacting to particularly things that happen to us in our youth. And then everything that happens after, it's sort of, to some extent, you're reacting with what life throws at you and adjusting to it. So, I think that's the universal part of my story. Yes, peculiarities come, to the particular childhood injury and what I did with it and where I went. And then certainly, yes, as we'll probably focus on in our conversation today, the experience in Thailand also, really, I'm still quite young. I'm 17 when I land in Thailand and work there on and off for the next 4 or 5 years. It obviously tremendously impacted my life and career direction going forward to this day.
Can imagine. What was it like when you landed as a very young, as a teenager, actually, in Thailand? What did you find there?
Well, I was a fairly good student, but I can't say I really knew much about other cultures. My grasp of history was really very cursory, and I had no idea what to expect. I land in Bangkok at midnight. The plane opens. It's not a jetway. It's the stairs rolled up to the plane, down onto the tarmac. The humidity like I've never experienced. It's midnight, but it's still probably 90 something degrees, 100% humidity. From that moment, and really for months that would follow, it was like I had consumed 20 cups of espresso. It was just tremendous sensory stimulation, excitement. Really, the one word I can use is I was overwhelmed, but in an exciting way. When you're young, that's not necessarily a bad feeling, and I knew I was kind of jumping in the deep end of the pool compared to my skills and my abilities and my experience. So, I knew that I was challenging myself. So, everything was, back in those days, I used to maybe say to my friends, it's sort of like in The Wizard of Oz when the house lands in Oz. It's like everything I'm looking at is fresh and new and unfamiliar, and I have to, constantly be trying to catch up and adjust and learn. And that most of that was youth and me. I mean, I think most people who would travel now do a little homework. And plus, we can also we're talking about a story that happened 44 years ago. This was pre-internet, right? I mean, even if I had been more diligent, I would have been reading out-of-date books in a library about Thailand, wouldn't have quite prepared me in the way that someone who's looking at living overseas now has a lot more resources, can learn a lot more about the country before they depart. But part of it was my maybe youthful laziness about, being organized in my learning. The other word, was the time. There weren't the resources weren't there.
I mean, it's something that I wanted to ask you also, because how much did you know of where you were going when you decided to go there? Because of course you have some social media, some media, not social media channels, probably newspapers, TV, talking about the Cambodian situation. It was a very rough situation after a civil war with Pol Pot, the whole Khmer Rouge, a system that was really torturing people, that there was a lot of that around. So a part of it, but I suppose the reality that you encounter when you arrive there and the refugees that you find there, it's another level. It's not the same thing that from media.
Yes, and I would say you're absolutely correct. So the media, to bring it back to the late 70s, we certainly, there was plenty of attention, even though I didn't follow the news like I do now. I was keenly aware of the Vietnam War. There were a lot of touch points, people in my community who served and so forth, and the news. But the Cambodian story was a little bit on TV, but mostly what was arriving in the newspapers and the magazines of the time. There was a cover story in Time magazine that really, gave me some background and some coverage in the New York Times that I was following. So I had, basic orientation to what was going on, really basic. But, that's, again, such a small window of orientation to have. And then really, I didn't understand how Thailand, related to Cambodia. They're different countries. They have different languages, right? So you're living and based in Thailand, but you make it up to the Cambodian border. Two different languages to think about, related, somewhat similar cultures, but really quite distinct. So, it was, and then, there were other refugee populations there were other ethnicities and so forth. And then in working with an international team, it really threw a lot at me. all in a good way. By the way, I hope my story just adds to the growing wealth of stories your other guests share about how enriching it is to have the opportunity to live in another country. And so this was the best in my impression is the best it could have been.
Nice.
Under very trying circumstances.
Yeah, exactly.
Responding to something really horrible, but in a way that brought out the best in the people who showed up. I think.
Yeah, I can imagine you met people you had strong connections with, and that you shared moments that were hard, but of course that build you as a person. It's also something that I wanted to ask you about, like how much you entered a little bit already into it, but how much your work in the refugee camps shaped the decision afterwards to become involved with becoming a physician and involving yourself a lot with health and human rights as you are involved right now.
Well, I think it had everything to do with it. I will say the decision to be a physician really was solidified from the burn injury. Even at 12, 13, well, in the hospital, I decided I wanted to be a physician, and that was, and I never departed from that. But it was certainly reinforced when I worked in the refugee camps, initially as a relief worker and then later as a resettlement worker. I looked with great admiration at the medical operations and the people who were doing medical work. And I really felt like that's ultimately where I want to be. Let me also just, pause here, if I may, and share with you and the listeners. You might wonder, I'm already sharing my enthusiasm with a life abroad and living abroad. And why am I not living abroad now? And why actually haven't I lived abroad for an extended period for over 30 years? There is a simple answer. My first son, who's now 30, was born with profound developmental disabilities and medical needs. So he cannot travel internationally. And I bring that up to just say that at any age, if you have the opportunity to live overseas, certainly it's going to be great. But consider doing things when you're young, because life develops complications. When you're young, you don't have entanglements. You don't have as many responsibilities. And maybe in some ways you're less set in your ways. So you're more open to the experience. So, if I could, I think I still would be living internationally if it could be safe for my son. Anyway, so a very circular way of coming back to the question you asked. When I realized I couldn't continue working overseas, I looked around for things that had the similar challenge: unmet need, marginalization, poor resources, maybe even biases against the population. And I found that in both jail, prison, and immigration detention work. I also did some work in state mental health institutions. So the same skills and perspective that I developed working overseas really helped me navigate and be successful when I turned to other populations.
Wonderful. I wanted to ask you, because you commented a couple of things you did in the refugee camps, like what was your work in there? Maybe two questions, like for the people who doesn't know, how does this work? Like how, even now or back then, how do you arrive to refugee camps? Who do you contact? Like through which organization, or like what's the process to arrive to there? And then who assigns you the work that you need to do, and what is the work that you did back then?
Great. Really good question. And, it's one of those do as I say, not as I do. I did not do it the right way at 17. I knew I wasn't doing it the right way. The right way is, if you want to do refugee work, is there are numerous international agencies, non-government organizations that are well established in doing refugee relief work. I actually at 17 was able to figure that out, and I did reach out to a number of them. Not surprisingly, they say, you're 17, haven't even finished high school, have no language skills, have no medical training. Thank you, kid. call us in a couple of years when you graduate from college. But that would be, the place to start. In my case, it was, I did, to some extent, benefit from the chaos of the moment. And my instincts at 17 were not wrong. As crazy as they were, I thought, well, if I get myself there and I show up and I say, you can argue whether I should have done this, but here I am. I'm here to help. And really not because I had much to offer did they put me in a van and send me out to the border. It was a small non-governmental organization that I first worked with. They just looked at me with sympathy and said, okay, kid, you're here, hop in the van. We'll find something for you to do. So they were being kind to me. They had no illusions that I had much to offer, but they let me tag along. And then, as soon as I was there, I had to find out how to be useful. Once you're in the camps, I think this would be still true, even though we're talking 40 years ago. I think the basic operations are the same. There is usually an international coordinating agency, and it depends on the conflict. It depends on the zone, but not atypically in those days, it was the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, usually working in close coordination with the host country government, host country being Thailand in this case, and their military to set up camps and coordinate them. And then they, in turn, work with the international agencies in coordinating the delivery of care. So it's not redundant. Like someone gets assigned, you're bringing in food, someone's bringing in clean water, someone's responsible for setting up shelters, someone's responsible for setting up medical care, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, sounds like a difficult work also to do, because especially for you, if you didn't know what were you going to do, especially I suppose someone who goes with a medical degree on their hands and they arrive there and they know that they will be taking care of the health of the people, but I assume there is thousands of other work, administrative, but also organization that needs to be done, and it also requires volunteers that are not at the level of I don't know, being doctors, for example, or being nurses. There is a lot of other roles involved in a refugee camp.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, if I make the analogy, I had a job back in the United States, even though I was still in high school, I was working at a company, in Connecticut. And, I had the job there of sort of being a gopher, someone who they send on errands and, fill in, can you help out here? Can you help this person do this? It was really analogous. They just said, okay, you're a body. Here, an expat body, because there are some. They certainly used a lot of refugee workers and they used Thai workers, but there were some limitations, both political and otherwise, on what those workers could do. So occasionally you needed that expat worker, whether it's right or wrong. And certainly at that time you had a different status in the camp. You could do things that you could get away with that maybe other people couldn't. So they used me, in a variety of things. But I got to tell you, the early months working there, it was more them letting me hang out than me really making a major contribution. But I hustled during that time to try to learn a little Cambodian language, which not many Americans in that era had any familiarity with the language, such that maybe through that I could be a little bit helpful. And indeed, even with really rudimentary conversational Khmer that I picked up, Khmer is the language of Cambodia, in the first few months, when I did show up on the doorstep of the embassy 3 months later, when my initial agency closed up shop because these are very unstable work environments, the embassy was a little bit surprised that I spoke any Cambodian, and they said we're about to start working with Cambodians. They hadn't yet been allowed into the Cambodian camps, but they were preparing for it. And they said, boy, you've been on the border and you speak a little Khmer. We could use you. So it wasn't much, but it was enough to get a toehold.
So that was one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, also language-wise and culture-wise, how do you adapt it? But maybe before we jump to that, I have a last question about you going there as a person. What is the reaction of your parents and your family back in the United States when you say, hey, I'm leaving to Thailand to go into help to do humanitarian work.
Well, thanks for asking that, and that I'll point back to the book. I think I do a good job telling that story because a lot of my friends and family who basically know the outlines of the story, in reading the full story, say, "Boy, we didn't realize how wonderful your parents handled this," and I want to echo that sentiment. When I discussed it as a general idea, I'd like to go and help out. They're enormously supportive, and they encouraged that first stage where they said, "Why don't you call some agencies and see if you can get a job, even as a volunteer, and we'll support you." But when that didn't work, I then said, "Well, maybe I'll just go there myself." And they said, "We can't let you do that. That's highly risky. It is a war zone. You can't go there by yourself. That's crazy."
Yeah.
And I don't blame them. So when I then, because the compulsion was so strong, when I leave a note and say, I'm on a plane and I'm headed to Thailand, which I knew would be, a cruel thing to do to them. I wasn't unaware of that as young as I was. The first call I made from when I got to Thailand, I'd wait a couple of days and go to the general post office again, pre-cell phone, pre-internet. You have to wait in a line in a phone bank and get this very echoey line that cost $100 for 3 minutes, which I did collect because I had no money in my pocket. And the first thing my father said to me is, "We'll talk about how you did what you did later. But now that you're there, know that your mother and I support what you are doing and do what you went there to do." Enormously wonderful parents I have. They're still alive, thank goodness. And by now I've apologized to them profusely for decades now, but I'll never make it up to them. So yeah, it was a big shock for them. Ultimately, I think they're very happy how things turned out. Within that first year of working in Thailand, they did come out and visit, which wasn't a small accomplishment. They were both teachers. They didn't have a lot of income. It was a big trip to undertake, but that's how much they supported what I did.
Incredible. Like a lot of parents will not react like that. That's for sure. So
no, so true.
It's good that your parents reacted like that because that built the man that you are now today. No, I suppose. So
I think so.
A big thanks to your parents also for being that supportive. So maybe going again or returning a little bit into the cultural and language side, like how did you find the people in the camps? Like, what was the situation in there? I assume that a lot of refugees are coming from different ethnicities because Cambodia was like the people who were persecuted in Cambodia were coming from very different backgrounds. Do you find a very, very segregated population, or it's a little bit like everyone together and or there is refugee camps where there is more like people from a Muslim background versus people from a pure Cambodian the ethnicity is separated in there?
Yeah. So when the population first sort of spilled across the border, I mean, the Thai had been trying to hold them back. Maybe we should set the scene a little bit for your listeners. Yes. This is, I arrived early 1980, but in late 1979, actually at the end of 1978, the Vietnamese, who are to the east, invade Cambodia, a communist country after the Vietnam War, invades another communist country to overthrow the Khmer Rouge because there's all sorts of reasons they're not happy with the Khmer Rouge and the Khmer Rouge on the border, and there have been some skirmishes, and they finally make the decision to invade, and that pushes the Khmer Rouge fleeing with the captive population that they had enslaved to the border. And then on the border, you have the Thai lined up, military, defending their border. So there's a sandwich of refugees in between the advancing Vietnamese forces, the retreating Khmer Rouge, some non-communist Cambodian resistance groups armed, and then there's the refugees, and then there's the Thai military, really sort of very volatile area, but heavily mined border, I should add, because that's very relevant to the refugee story, landmines. And initially there were a mixing of these populations in the chaos of the initial spillover, but you are correct. There were different, as much as I would say ethnic, maybe some of it's also social. So, the Khmer Rouge largely drew from rural, less educated peoples, and their people they oppressed during that regime and persecuted were people from the cities, and certainly included ethnicities that were non-Khmer, or at least Khmer mix, so Sino-Khmer, Chinese Khmer, and Laotians or Vietnamese living in the cities. By the time I get to the camp I go to, which is really the southernmost camp on that border, my route, a fairly small camp, they had literally segregated sections or camps. Really, there are two small camps when I got there. One was Khmer Rouge, and in fact, there were Khmer Rouge who had fled from a purge, so from turmoil of a purge in like 1977, 78. And then there was the new camp, and the new camp were the type of people who were most victimized by the Khmer Rouge, during their reign from 1975 to 79. So there was that sort of segregation. What did I feel when I first interacted? Again, the word overwhelmed comes to mind in terms of hearing the survival stories, which started flooding over me almost from the moment I walked through the gate of the camp. But at the same time, what really struck me, and still to this day I love, is the Cambodian people are a very friendly people. They're very polite. They're very welcoming. And in light of what had just happened, they had resilience that was palpable. So really in the most trying of circumstances, what I'm really picking up and taking away is how wonderful these people are, and how much I have to learn from them.
Yeah. I suppose like when people pass through struggles and then they're still, I don't know, happy and they're still able to share things. No, that's when you realize that not all it's lost. Let's say like this. It is very curious the fact, no, like or like in the Cambodian crisis moment, or the refugee, the fact that there is also part of who are the persecutors, or like there is victims, people who were part of the system who was like also like persecuting specific ethnicities or specific targets of society, let's say like this, but they are also fleeing because the system is so brutal that it even purged themselves.
Absolutely.
How was this tension? How do you live with this tension, knowing that the other small camp next to you, or the neighbor next to you, it's belonging to the group that has forced you to leave your own home? Did you feel this tension inside of the camps?
Absolutely. There was space between them, but you could literally look from the fence of one camp and see the other camp. Now, the Khmer Rouge, even though they had been victims of a party purge, they were still wearing the black pajamas and rubber tire sandals that you might have seen in pictures from that era. They still remained sort of loyal to the cause, and I was maybe on purpose, being one of the few Americans there. They did not assign me to work in regularly in the old camp, although I did have occasions to visit it and go in it. And particularly the men in the old camp, they viewed me with suspicion and didn't really want to have much to do with me. Interestingly, the women were more approachable and friendly. But in contrast, everyone in the new camp, well, I had a crowd around me all the time, and people were very affectionate and generous. But they would look across and see, their oppressors, that close. And it really almost symbolized how tenuous the situation was. Looking back, and I talk about in the book, there's two families I befriend that I am very close with to this day. 44 years later, who did eventually make it to the United States and Canada to safety. But, in that moment, we had every reason to believe that they could be pushed back across the border into minefields, into uncertain future, into violence at any moment. No one, they're really hanging on by fingernails on the border. So to have to do that while looking across the way and seeing the Khmer Rouge that close was, I think, a great source of stress for the residents of the camp, and to me was, just a dramatic thing to witness.
Yeah, I suppose in every refugee crisis there is always this uncertainty of like if the host country can throw you back, because it happens. It really happens sometimes.
Absolutely,
no?
absolutely, and in fact, fairly commonly.
Unfortunately, people who suffer more even when they think that they arrive to safety. And
that's right. And in the Cambodian case, there was a very famous episode that had happened by the time I arrived, where the Thai forced thousands of people over a cliff through a minefield back into Thailand. That's the incident at Prevahir. So the refugees knew that story. So it wasn't a theoretical possibility. It actually happened with great suffering and death. So yeah, not a theoretical and not uncommon in refugee situations.
You said you befriend people in there, full families. Incredible that you still have the contact with them. That's very, very nice. Like that you still have like the capability of reaching them out to know where they are and what they are doing. How is this cultural difference between do you notice a lot of cultural I don't know how to say it,
maybe gap? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So so think about this. So the one family that I focus on most in the telling of the story was a widow and her 7 children. The youngest child being about 4 years old, and the oldest the oldest 3 children being daughters. The oldest is my age, and then her next sister is maybe a year younger than me, and the next sister is maybe 3 years younger than me. So while I'm just, I'm sort of an honorary adult because I have a job in the camp and I'm an American, and that's how it worked. But I was dealing with her, the mom, and I was dealing with the other couple, the man who was my translator when I first arrived there, Lee, because he was one of the only refugees who spoke English. But the mom, Tita, and I had the main relationship, but I was constantly trying to figure out how to relate to these young women that are my age. And the reason the word gap popped into my mind is there was a huge cultural, there's a language gap, but also a huge cultural gap. Cambodian women in that era were very modest, very socially reserved, and very, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to try to interact with me, or if so, very limited, So, and I was trying to bridge that gap. And, if we jump to the, years that follow, and it took decades, now those women are as close to me as my own blood sisters. I mean, we're very close. We are family. And we kind of look back and laugh and say, like, when we first saw each other, we didn't know how we would ever connect, or if we ever would, how we would connect. It took time. It is, I think, the main answer I can share with you. I did form an initial connection with them there, and they me, but because they were also young and didn't know how to negotiate cross-cultural experiences like that. And of course, what obviously helped is they did resettle to the United States, and they learned more really about my culture as I was continuing to learn more about theirs. It helped narrow that gap, and to a point now where, decades later, the gap is pretty much gone. But it didn't happen quickly.
Can imagine. How did you? I assume that another slow process was also learning languages and being able to communicate. I assume that at the point of time, people who speak English in the camps were very few, especially from
Yes.
for the refugee side. How were you communicating? And you said also that you learned a little bit of Cambodian languages, and you were able to catch a little bit up on that. How was the process for learning there?
Well, I mean, it was, when you think of a 17-year-old and what do we teach young people about learning a second language, for an immersion experience. I had to, if Lee wasn't available, the only way I could communicate was in Khmer. And so, sure, when, over the first week or so, he rapidly, teaches me my first 30 or 40 words. And for a while, I have the conversation with people as far as I can get with those 30, and I continue to build on that. Now, there's a cautionary tale here, and I imagine some of your other guests have talked about this, but people who look at people who go to another country and learn language, there's a bit of a plateau once you gain sort of conversational level in a new language. And then it's really hard to push through to true fluency and competency. And I'll have to confess that as I arrived at that conversational level of comfort, with, by the way, people tell me fairly good pronunciation, because the first time I ever tried to learn the word, I was being taught in the Cambodian border by Cambodians. But I never really mastered the language the way I should, largely because then, by 3 or 4 months, I get the job at the embassy. I'm doing work. You have to use interpreters because it's legal work. And I'm now back to mostly speaking English and allowing an interpreter to translate for me. And then I'll take, credit myself that I never quite put the effort in I could have to master the language. I'm still happy I have some conversational Khmer, but I admire my friends, and have many of them who are truly bilingual in many languages. Not something, of all my accomplishments, not something I've truly accomplished. I speak a little of a number of languages, but I'm barely fluent in English, as you've probably already determined.
Well, definitely better English than mine. That's for sure. Like that's where it comes. My second, third language. I don't know what it is actually. I improve also. Like as you said, like best way is get yourself where you need to speak the language, and not.
That's right.
Or because of whatever reason. I have a question around like the fact that you are living inside of a country, but dealing mainly with another culture. So you actually are in the refugee camps of Cambodian people, with Cambodian culture around you, with Cambodian language, but officially you are in Thailand, and at some point you are working with the US Embassy. It's the US Embassy work also in the camps, or it's some moment that you need to immerse yourself also in the Thailand culture and the world of Thailand itself, and not so much Cambodian?
Yeah. So most of the work I did on that first trip, and really all across the 5 years that I was there on and off, was in camps. I would eventually work in Laotian camps, Hmong camps, Vietnamese camps. Most of my time on the Cambodian border, though. But in all those cases, I'll talk about the book. I, without permission, used to stay in the camp with the families I mentioned, unauthorized. But for most of the time I was in country, you'd go work in the camps during the day, but you'd go back to the town in Thailand at night. Okay. So when you're talking about adapting to cultures, I also had to learn enough conversational Thai to get around, because you're in rural Thailand. You're in Bangkok. It wasn't too hard to find Thai who spoke very good English, but you went up country and very few people did. So, to get by, you had to get conversational, at least in the basic, of things of how to order a meal, or where's the market, or negotiate, or haggle, and all the things that you have to do to get by. So while I'm trying to learn Khmer, I'm also needing to learn enough Thai. And again, very different languages from different language families. There's not a whole lot of overlap. Thai, for example, is a tonal language, and Khmer is not, and so forth. Culturally, again, some similarities, but really quite distinct differences. So, yeah, I was trying to learn Thai culture and language, while at the same time I was trying to learn Cambodian culture and language. And just to throw in the mix, during that first trip, I got assigned to a Vietnamese camp for about 4 or 5 months. So, throw in, again,
Gosh.
totally different culture, totally different language. Maybe helps explain why I didn't master any one of these new languages. But still, all different. I guess I mastered them as quickly as I could, as best I could, but by any objective measure, my mastery was rudimentary in all of those areas.
On the other hand, you are able to meet multiple cultures and not a single one, which I assume it brings also a lot of richness on your way of seeing the world.
Absolutely. I think so.
I wanted to ask you a little bit, going maybe into your personal view on the whole thing. What are some of the most favorite memories that you have from your time in Thailand?
Well, to this day, I love Thailand and the Thai people, and I love Cambodia and the Cambodian people, the Vietnamese people. And I mentioned before why I don't live overseas, but boy, at least once a year I try to get back to the area for a short trip, just to be there, just to be among the people. And I let me also add, if you visit any new country for any period of time, but even if it's just a matter of a couple of weeks, if you can get out of the cities, go to the smaller areas off the beaten path, because that's where you really see the country. Nothing wrong with international cities. We all love them. We usually a good base when you land and you're getting oriented. But my experiences with the people in Thailand and Cambodia in the rural areas, to me, have been the richest and most rewarding. So, when I think of Thailand or Cambodia, the food's great. We haven't talked about all the wonderful tropical fruits that we don't quite have in the United States, or if you get them, they're imported and not fresh. There's so many things to like about the culture, but for me, it all comes down to a really basic thing. I love the people. I love the interactions I've had with them. They're warm and welcoming and generous people. So that's, to me, the best memories, and still very active. I go back, seeking that company on a regular basis.
Well, it's very nice that you still have a contact with it and you still go back after more than 40 years later. That says a lot of how much it marked you. You entered a little bit on the question that I wanted to ask you, and it was like food, drinks. How different was it? But you still miss some of this food, some of these drinks, traditional from Thailand?
Well, so we did. So I did refer a little bit to fruit, but let's go back to that 17-year-old kid getting off the plane, and then the next day met up with another world traveler who kindly was showing me the ropes, and we just went out. I had like $50 in my pocket at this point, and no job and no prospects, and managed very carefully that would sustain you for about a week if you bought just street food. But off we go to buy street food, and he had my travel companion who I met at the airport, another American. He had been to Thailand before, and he was introducing me to the foods. And one of the first things we get is a plate of curry. Now, I grew up in Connecticut in a largely white community, and we had no hot sauce or anything. And if Thai curry, especially as served in Thailand, I remember taking the first bite, and my head wanted to explode, and I thought, oh my goodness, how am I going to survive here? I can't eat this stuff. And it's funny. Again, the impact of travel. Anyone who knows me now knows I'm addicted to curry. I love curry. And if I don't get good curry, I start, seeking it out like a drug withdrawal. So, travel or living internationally pushes you beyond your comfort zone. And remember, if at first you don't like something, don't give up on it right away. To survive, because people kept serving it to me, I had to keep eating curry. And to literally on that first trip, I remember it's like something clicked, and I was eating and going like, actually, I like this. There was no in between. It wasn't a slow transition. Something clicked where, I don't know, I got it. I appreciated it, and now love it. There are so many other times. I mean, things like the fried noodles and the fried rices, those were easier to adjust to from my very, untraveled palate. But, there were other foods too that, even just seeing from my middle class white background in the Northeast of the United States, you'd get the noodle soups in the morning, and then they'd have tripe in them and other pieces of the animal that I wasn't used to seeing, including, chicken feet. And so it's like, that was all new, but I did have that good youthful attitude that, I put myself here and I should be open to what people are doing here, and I should try things. And, so I did. And, did I enjoy everything that was put in front of me? No, but I learned to appreciate almost all of it.
I mean, I'm really up to curry also, so I think I would really like to. I've never been to Thailand before, but I take your word. As soon as I land and I go there, first thing that I would do, although we try to replicate a little bit the Thai curry here. It's, I assume, never close to the original recipes of Don in Thailand.
So true. Probably where you are, just like in the United States, there weren't when I went over 44 years ago, but now every small town seems to have a Thai restaurant. But what those Thai restaurants in America have done is, over time, is turn down the heat and the spice level to accommodate the American tastes. And if I'm lucky and get to talk to the cook and just say, quickly in my limited Thai, hey, I lived in Thailand, I want it like you're making it for a Thai person, then it'll come out like that. But so often I'll order it, and I'm disappointed at how bland it is here compared to Thailand.
Yeah, can't imagine. So maybe two last questions before we jump to the second part of the episode. The first one would be music. Are you a music person in general? Like, do you remember if there was music involved in life? Because it's one of the common things that a lot of places have, and they have their traditional styles and things.
So yes, absolutely. I got to tell you, you ask, am I interested in music? I'm an amateur musician. I'm a singer-songwriter. I live and breathe music. It to me is so therapeutic, and always has been. Since my childhood injury, it's one of the ways I coped. And when I was preparing to go to work in a refugee camp in a foreign country, in a war zone, I remember talking to my friends. My friends said, "What are you going to? You're not going to have music." Remember, this is even pre-Walkman era. There was it's like not like I couldn't bring a Walkman to listen to my music. That would come out a year or two later. And revolutionize my travel experience. But at the time, and then I played piano and guitar, and like they said, you're not going to have those there either. So I arrived in the camp, and it, I shouldn't have been surprised, but there are a couple beat up guitars there. And I mentioned to someone, I play guitar. Can I borrow your guitar and play? And one of the most, when I didn't have a lot of language to connect to people, once I started strumming that guitar and singing, say, Beatles songs, which they were familiar with, it was just such a lovely way to sort of break the ice. Now, the next thing is I started, in those early camps, to start to learn about the pop stars from Cambodia that sadly, the most prominent of them had been executed and killed in the revolution. So, there's a male, the most famous Cambodian male vocalist of the 1960s, 1970s was Sinsi Samut, and probably the woman Ros Sore Sotia. People had cassettes of their music. Usually poor quality because they were pirated multiple times. But they would play them in the camps, and they wanted me to know, listen to our music. So that first exposure to Cambodian pop music. Now, there is also Cambodian traditional music, which you would also see the very small number of traditional Khmer musicians who had survived were preserving both Thai kind of gamelan music that similar to music you'll see in Thailand and all the way down through Indonesia and Malaysia. Very percussive, and like the xylophones and the drosaw are like violin instruments, combined with traditional Cambodian dance. Now, most of the dance teachers and music teachers had been executed, but the few people who had learned and still retained the skill were trying to revive those arts even in the camps. So that was all, new to me. And again, it was easier to relate to the Cambodian pop music, which had a close relationship to American pop music, although a very distinct Cambodian style. But the traditional music was even further afield. And it's sort of like, I suppose when the West first comes into contact, say, with Indian traditional music, on first listening, you go like, I don't even know where to grab onto this. But if you invest some time into it over time, profoundly moving. And so now I have appreciation for both the Cambodian pop music and the traditional music. By the way, there's a documentary that came out a few years ago called Don't Think I've Forgotten, that you can find streaming, that tells the story of the Cambodian pop scene prior to the Khmer Rouge, and then the very sad ending of so many of those musicians. But it's a story that's worth checking out.
Nice. Actually, the last question that I wanted to ask on this part of the episode was any recommendations that you would give, book, documentaries, movies, anything that, of course, besides your own book, probably that it also touches your experience in there, but any resource that somebody needs to read or to see, watch before going to Thailand or to Cambodia?
Well, it depends. If you're, in particular in Cambodia, if you want to have some appreciation for that period, we're talking 40 years ago, but it's such a enormously important period. I think, if you look at, you can say the Armenian genocide was a long time ago, but isn't it relevant to anyone who's visiting Armenia now? And the Holocaust in Europe was a long time ago. So the Khmer Rouge period is really a profound period in Cambodian history, in modern Cambodian history. I still think probably the quickest and easiest way to get a handle on that is the film The Killing Fields, that came out in the early 1980s. It still really hasn't, I don't think, been surpassed. A lot of it was filmed on location. And literally the Cambodian star of that movie was not only a Cambodian refugee who worked with us at the embassy, he was a physician. So there's a real authenticity to that story. More recently, the book and movie First They Killed My Father is another Cambodian perspective by Ung Luong on that period. But if you're talking about just being practical, the book that I'm sure it's on the bookshelf behind me, because I still have it and many subsequent editions, but the Lonely Planet series, which was in its infancy when I first went to Thailand, saved my butt. So if you're just looking for practical advice, that type of series, I'm not necessarily endorsing that above others, but a general sort of guide that gives you a brief orientation to the history, maybe a little bit of cultural orientation, a little bit of tips on language, and suggests sort of strategies on how you negotiate your way around the country. Those kind of resources are worth their weight in gold.
I think still a very valid, even with, I also have Lonely Planet like guides, even if the way of getting information about traveling has changed so much and everyone is like still referring quite much to the internet and everything. We still value these ones, especially for specific countries that maybe the information that it's online, it's not always the most accurate on the reality, but more like a touristic approach on what it's out there.
And I would be remiss if I didn't say, people do ask younger people who hear the essence of my story and they go, how did you find your way around, without your iPhone, without your maps, without your ability to look things up, without Google Translate? How'd you do it? And I said, for those people my age and older, we have a simple answer. We used to walk up to strangers and ask for advice or ask for help. something that's a little bit been lost in the age of the internet. So don't forget
Absolutely.
that still works, especially in countries where people, I suppose in the United States being one of them, you try to walk up to a stranger on the street and ask them a question in the United States compared to when I was growing up. There's now suspicion of like, why do you need directions? Why don't you look on your phone? Like, what are you trying to pull here? But I still find, again, you talk about rural Thailand, rural Cambodia, you can walk up to a stranger and strike up a conversation and you won't be viewed with suspicion. And maybe that's a disappearing thing, but while it's still here, take advantage of it.
Absolutely. Well, with these last recommendations, I would say that we jump to the second part of today's episode. Hey there, everyone. If you're loving this episode so far and you want to stay tuned with other expat experiences, make sure to hit the subscribe button and follow our podcast so you never miss an episode. On top of that, we are now offering one-on-one calls to help you kickstart your own YouTube channel, launch a podcast, or navigate the journey of becoming an expat. Whether you are dreaming of sharing your story with the world or just need some guidance on your expat adventure, we've got you covered. Check the product section on our website, expatexpertspodcast.com, or check the link in the description and book your session today. With that said, let's go back to the episode.
The Expert, healthcare in US prisons and immigration detention centers.
It's also a jump on time, what we are doing now. So you've been working very close right now, or since some years, addressing the challenges that the healthcare system is providing in prisons and immigration detention centers in the US. And of course, the first question and the obligated question is, when did you start with this work and why did you start with this work?
So as we touched upon a little briefly before, I worked on and off through my college years. I worked in Thailand in the refugee program, so from 1980 to 85. And then I came back to pursue my medical education. But even while doing that, I set up with a community health center in Providence, Rhode Island, where I went to medical school. I set up one of the first Cambodian focused clinics in their community health center network. And continued and did make some trips back to Thailand to do some research and support work there, and was in a track being groomed and trained to do international health when I married a medical school classmate. And as we were finishing our residencies, our first child was born. As I mentioned before, he had really compelling and profound health challenges. Suddenly, a decade of preparing for international work, it seems like it's out the window and irrelevant. And I initially did some work in community health centers, which satisfied some of the same needs of wanting to do that kind of work. But then a former colleague from training called up and said, gee, I know you like working overseas and you can't now, but you might find working at the prison as a medical doctor might give you the same sort of satisfaction and rewards of addressing compelling unmet needs and in a challenging environment. So off I went, and I worked in the state of Rhode Island as a primary care physician, eventually the medical director of the state prison and jail system. And indeed, there were a lot of overlaps that I just described. Compelling, sort of higher rates of disease, poor resources, often not only ignored by the public, but ignored by the profession of medicine, and a lot of systemic problems in delivering care. So I was able to take some of the insights and lessons from working in resource-challenged areas and working with populations that people were not seeing or being aware of, and bring some of those experiences from overseas to my work and working in jails and prisons.
I see. So a lot of it's like, transition into needing to go overseas or to other countries where your work was required. You were also a PHR, so the physicians with humanitarian background, let's say like this. So you went to a lot of trips outside of the US after the living in Thailand for a certain amount of time, you work in other countries, not as an extended time, but you've done work in other situations of crisis and other difficult moments in other overseas regions.
Well, yes. So as you said, now I shifted from the long-term type of work to more consultative, but also learned over time. In medicine, we might say you can have a Band-Aid approach. You get a cut, and I come along and I put on the Band-Aid. But if everyone keeps coming in with cuts, I might go, who's cutting these people? Like, can I move upstream and try to prevent the injuries? Advocacy and public health sort of perspective. These are things that are both relevant to working with refugee populations, but are also relevant to working with jails and prisons. You can just respond to every unmet health need in the moment, or you can start to look at them more systemically and say, do we have opportunities to be more effective? And advocacy for the resources and needs of the population. These are the overlaps that really help me.
Makes a lot of sense. And I suppose the systemic approach, it is a little bit better than just taking care of the lower level. If you can cut the source, the root of the problem. Can you describe a little bit what I assume there is multiple, and maybe we don't have the time to go over all of them, but some of the systematic issues that you have been tackling in prisons and detention centers in the US right now?
Well, broadly speaking, I think the two big areas when you talk about the intersection of health and justice internationally, but certainly in the United States, is that so many people, and I think many of your listeners probably are aware, the United States incarcerates at a higher rate than most countries in the world or in history. And a majority of the people incarcerated have unmet needs when they're in the community in two broad areas. One is unmet mental health needs, and the other is unmet needs around addiction. And as you can imagine, there's overlap between those two areas. So there's a good example of, you can deal with someone while they're in crisis, or you can maybe revive someone from an overdose in the moment. But if you're not more effectively addressing and treating the underlying diseases in the community, boy, I think you can expect there to be bad outcome from the natural history of both of those conditions. So then in a related note, a lot of the work I did over the years related to infectious diseases, which also go hand in hand to some extent with addiction. The epidemics of HIV and viral hepatitis B and C were, at least in decades prior, largely tied to shared needle use and injection drug use. So, again, these were all areas that, again, you could treat one individual patient, or you could take a step back and say, how do we, more from a public health perspective, how do we better protect? I do want to make one more health issue that's related to the mental health, but when I'm pivoting, you mentioned I also do work consulting and visiting and auditing care in immigration detention, which is really, slightly different than the correctional system for people convicted of crimes or charged with crimes. And there, you see it in both jails and prisons, but more pronounced in immigration centers, which are a little bit more like refugee camps. You see more impact of trauma on the population. So what they call trauma-informed care, which is care where not just the mental health person is sensitive to the fact that you've been traumatized, but you teach everyone who works in that facility how to be more sensitive to people who have suffered trauma. That's an example of adapting a systematic approach to working with the population, in addition to working with them one-on-one.
I see. So you notice differences between the detention centers and the prisons. I suppose the problems facing in these two situations are not always the same. They
Correct.
reside a lot into mental health, probably not being tackled, which is also a problem of society in general, I would say. No,
Yes. Yes. Right.
we deal with mental health as it was something less than other kinds of practicing. No, we take more care of our bones broken, but our mental health it's the last thing that we take care of.
Absolutely.
How do you deal with mental health in environments where you're privated of freedom or movement or
Well, you really hit it right on the head. So first of all, there's the usual resource constraints. Generally, all medical services, but particularly mental health services, are not as properly resourced in proportion to the need. But you've sort of touched on another important issue. The environments themselves are harmful to mental health, and there's really a rich literature on that, particularly in immigration detention, where the detention can be indefinite. One advantage, if you're convicted of a crime in the United States and you're sentenced to prison, you have a fair idea of how long you might be there, although there are adjustments for good behavior and maybe appeals for early parole, but you have a fixed idea of what you're facing. You get picked up in immigration detention, you're often in an indefinite detention situation. You don't know if you're going to be there for a week, a month, a year, 2 years, 5 years. And that creates an enormous stress on people caught up in those systems. And that's an international phenomenon, not unique to the United States.
How much of your work then it's actually working inside of these centers, like inside of prison or the institutions itself, or trying to avoid these things? Because, for example, you touched the fact of shared needles, and the addiction infections, for example, but that's something that it comes not only inside of the system of prisons or these closed systems. It happens in society in general. So how do you try to prevent that from a previous step to arriving to the penitentiary centers?
It's a great question, because another thing my colleagues in the profession have been trying to work on for years as we interface with people in government officials and public health officials, is to remind them that jails and prisons and immigration detention are not, as you might think, walled off, isolated. If you're walking around in the free world, you just don't need, if you're humanitarian good, you can care about what's going on in there, but the rest of us don't need to worry about it. It doesn't concern us. Then you don't know anything about jails, prisons, or immigration detention, because they happen to be areas of high turnover, especially jails, where you're maybe held for a matter of days before you're released in court. And as such, actually, they're a very important part, particularly in infectious disease. We and my colleagues anticipated, as COVID was developing, that the government and the public health authorities had not factored in jails, prisons, and immigration detention. They were tinderboxes of how you could effectively spread infectious diseases like COVID. And indeed, in spite of our warnings, some facilities did listen, some didn't. We basically said, you got it. You were emptying colleges. You were breaking up all sorts of congregate living settings as much as you could. You're getting people off cruise ships, but you were leaving everyone in jails and prisons. And as you know, and internationally as well as in the United States, there are a number of huge outbreaks that spilled over into the surrounding community because people didn't realize that the jails and prisons are part of our community. And when you're looking at public health, they're actually ideal places to deliver resources to, because not only are you dealing with a high burden of disease and mental health and addiction in jails and prisons, but in addressing them, you're positively impacting the community with downstream effects that are often, in the case of infectious disease, fairly immediate.
You said a couple of times the term public health, and it's something that maybe it's from a European perspective, and maybe it's a little bit biased, no? But how does it work? Like, because normally, or what it arrives informationally wise to us, it's that the American system of health, it's rather private, so it's difficult to access even for normal people outside. It's expensive. How does it work when you are in a detention center, when you are on a prison? Who pays for that? Who is taking care? Of course, you are there. No, I suppose that's basically your role. But is is it part of like I don't know, a bundle of the government saying, okay, this goes to prisons, and that includes the health of the prisoners, or is it a separate
Yeah.
institution?
It depends on where you are. There are some health programs in jails and prisons that are run through the health departments of the state, and then but more commonly, they're usually run by the jail and prison bureaucracy itself. But you did use the term healthcare system or American healthcare system. I have a colleague and advocate who likes to remind us whenever we use that term. He says, no, actually, the problem in the U.S. is we don't have a system at all. We have, a lot of private, parties all in the space, but there's no really organized system. But the interesting thing in the United States, not immediately relevant to immigration detention because the rights of non-citizens are different, but for jails and prisons that house U.S. citizens, there have been two major Supreme Court cases, one in 1976 and the other in 2011, that have reaffirmed the government's obligation to provide medical care for people they incarcerate under the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishments. So ironically, the one population in the United States that has a constitutional guarantee and access to care are people who are in jail and prison. So think about the bit of irony there. Now, does it mean they get the best of best care? Or does it mean they often even get adequate care? No, but it does give lawyers and the legal profession some foundation to advocate effectively when there are gaps in healthcare. And right now, in my own home county in Southern California, in Riverside, I have been appointed by a federal court to monitor improvements in the healthcare program in my county jail. So often using the legal mechanism is how the standards and care are maintained, but it's a constant battle.
Can't imagine that it's not something that comes out of the blue. No, it's years of working on it. One of the questions that I also wanted to ask you, it's how has your work, where is the little victories or the victories that you had in these years of like trying to improve the healthcare system in prisons and detention centers in the US for you? Like, what is the moments that you say, now we are doing something, now I'm changing this?
So it took years, and often, I got to be honest, I would get discouraged and pessimistic. I have a colleague I should give a shout out to. His name is Jody Rich, and together we founded the Center for Health and Justice Transformation at Brown University. But Jody of the partnership is always the eternally optimistic one. And he's always encouraged me when I'm getting discouraged to just keep going. But, one quick example I think would be hepatitis C. When I first started treating patients in prison, even the National Institutes of Health said, don't treat people in prison with hepatitis C. It's too hard to do. And, just don't do it. That was actually, the health authority in the United States, the academic recommendation. And as someone who was treating patients who needed to be treated, I had a problem with that. And with Jody's help, we started treating patients in our state prison. We turned out to be among the first to do that, and then published our results and shared with the world, and then supported or helped out in strategic litigation over the next few years. Long and short is now, if you're incarcerated, you have access to hepatitis C care. And,
Okay.
when we started, it was quite the opposite. You were told you can't get it, even though it was, when I first began my career, it was the leading cause of death in my state prison. So, that's one example I think we can, and there are, just as an example, because there are other areas, and particularly my colleague Jody Rich's work, he's made great strides in addiction-related treatments and harm reduction, where even if you're still using addictive substances, you're doing it in a way that reduces risk of transmission of HIV and viral hepatitis and other diseases. So, there are areas, I think, where we've made a great success. And then finally, if you read on my background, probably what I achieved most, maybe the word is notoriety in the United States, is pushing back on the detention of children in immigration detention. And without as much fanfare or attention, are pushed back with many other advocates working with us. At least right now, we do not detain children with their families. We still detain unaccompanied minors, but we did make progress in basically shutting the family detention centers that were so much the focus of attention under the previous administration. Those do not exist, at least for the moment. They could always come back, but you take these even limited and temporary victories and run with them.
Well, that's, for my perspective, it's a big victory. No, even if it's temporary, these things are important, and it's you should be proud of them. No, it's and when I mean you, it's also the next question was going to be related. You always talk in plural a little bit when you talk about this. I assume it's not a one-man job. It's a work of multiple people. Are you associated inside of some kind of organization, or how does this work comes together?
Yeah, that's a great question. Early in my career, I had more formal roles with organizations, and I still, so you mentioned PHR, which is Physicians for Human Rights, a really great organization that I've been working with now for decades. And earlier on, I had very formal roles with them, including times part-time employment with them. My relationship with them now is as one of their medical advisors. And so, in a more intimate way, I do work with them. I still work as an expert consultant with both the federal courts and the Department of Homeland Security on the immigration detention issues. But that's sort of end of career. I'm sort of well established in the field now, so people now reach out to me for consultations and advice. But earlier on, yes, the point you started with, I really want to emphasize. To the extent that I think I've had a somewhat successful career, I never achieved anything acting alone. It really was finding partnerships. Well, that's true in life and in general. So he's like, one of the things where, the heart of your program, why go overseas, is to make connections, to broaden your perspective, to learn how to collaborate with people who are very different than you. Now you bring that, you learn to do that in another country, and you come back to your home country, what seemed like cultural gaps in your domestic setting really start to seem small, and you're like, boy, if I could learn how to connect, at least have a conversation with a rural Khmer Rouge rice farmer, this guy who lives next door, whose politics are a little different than mine, and he dresses differently, and culturally he's differently. Yeah, I can probably find a way to connect to him. So the importance of working with other people, working with communities, finding like-minded people to do the work you want to do is the key to success.
Completely agree. It's better when you have multiple hands working on something, no, and pushing in a correct direction,
and multiple perspectives, right?
And accepting perspectives from other perspectives. It's also part of
absolutely.
On that sense, maybe like one little bit more personal question when it comes to accepting and leading, or dealing with moments that maybe that doesn't really work. How did you cope with ethical moments working with prisoners, and especially with I assume in prisons and certain environments you find people that you, by your ethicality and your morality, would not align with, you would not actually like to be involved, but at the end, how you separate your work from your ideal of what it's correct or not.
Boy, too bad this is coming at the very end of our conversation. It's such an important question, and ethics in particular has guided, I think you could probably have, figured this out, has guided my whole career. And there are tremendous ethical conflicts in the type of work I do. I think you're referring to actually one of the easiest to address, and that is, how did I feel about caring for people? Rhode Island was a small state. I knew even though we say in correctional medicine, you generally don't ask what you're in for. It's not relevant. But you can't avoid reading the papers. So some of the more notorious and horrific people who had killed multiple people, who had raped and killed children, these were my patients. But I got to tell you that part was actually easy, because I did truly believe that my job was to provide healthcare without judgment to everyone, and I was comfortable with that principle. It was for everyone else. I don't object to the fact that there's a judicial system and that there's punishment meted out, and that if you're spiritual, that maybe there's a larger frame of where justice beyond this life is meted out. But that had nothing to do with my professional responsibilities. In fact, you can get into trouble real fast if you start making judgments about your patients. So that was the easiest part. The bigger challenges come when there's conflicts between what physicians and other health professionals are asked to do in detention settings, that come into conflict with the conflicting mission of what the detention authority has. So I'm thinking ethical conflicts that are well known to us in the field. The medical profession says you never force feed a hunger striker, but most U.S. prisons say legally, absolutely, you have to force feed a hunger striker. So these ethical conflicts come up that physicians have to negotiate. And I've spent a lot of my career helping other physicians navigate those ethical dilemmas. So the ethics really, yes, enormously ethically challenging. You really have to have a firm ethical compass. And remember, as a professional, you don't always do what you're told. You do what the ethics of your profession dictate, even if it means standing and objecting to the institution you work for, even when it's the state or federal government.
That's a strong statement. I agree completely. Like, I think it world will be better if a lot of people stayed by their ethicals instead of following orders. No, maybe.
Right. Yes.
Maybe the last question, also a little bit related to this, that has been already a recommendation for everyone who wants to enter this field. But maybe the last question before we close the interview would be, what would be your advice for anyone who is in the healthcare professional who is interested in entering the field that you worked the last years?
Well, that one's actually finally the easiest question you've asked all day. Most jails and prisons in the United States have trouble recruiting good healthcare professionals. So I think, if you have any interest, it's probably not that hard to look at job vacancies in healthcare systems, in jails, prisons, and so forth. And you will probably find that, wherever you live, relatively close to you, that there might be vacancies available. And I encourage people to do it. If you went into medicine because you wanted to address unmet healthcare needs, there it is. As a little bonus, in the United States, because it's all a privatized system, a lot of people get burnt out doing medicine in the community because of all the hassles of billing and so forth. If you work for a prison, as we talked about before, it is funded through the government. It's the only place we have socialized medicine. You're only spending time focusing on the care, and yes, with limited resources and trying to get what you need for your patients, but you're not doing as much documentation and paperwork that drives people crazy in the private sector. And lastly, if you're up for a challenge, the cultural challenges, there's another culture that we didn't talk about, going in and working among people in uniform whose job it is to detain people. That's a different world. And how you interface with them, where you're, in contrast to the hospital or the clinic, you're not the authority. You walk into a jail and prison, the security people run the place. You're there almost as a guest, a required guest, but a guest nonetheless. You don't call the shots. Hospital, clinic, the doctors call the shots. So it's enormously challenging, but enormously rewarding. And most people who try it, I think, find it very rewarding.
Thank you so much, Scott. It has been an enormous pleasure to have you and to be able to talk about all these topics that a lot of people doesn't have the perspective that you have and the experience that you have. So I'm 100% sure that our listeners will extract fantastic ideas and experiences out of this conversation. It has been an enormous pleasure really to be able to talk to you about your time in Thailand, but also your work in life. And thanks for your work. Also, I think it's incredible, and it has been a pleasure to be able to interview you.
Well, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. The pleasure was all mine. And lastly, thank you for everything you're doing with your podcast. I think to the extent that you're opening people's eyes to the rewards of cross-cultural experiences, I salute you and I support you.
Thank you so much. Maybe a last thing before we close the episode, it would be if there is any way besides, of course, reading the book that you published. Where can listeners find your story a little bit more? Of course, reading first the book and then find you out there. So people who is interested in knowing a little bit more about you.
The book again is called Across a Bridge of Fire. It's available on Amazon and through a variety of places where it can be ordered. The best place, one stop to go, is to drscottallen.com. That's DRSCOTTALLEN.com for more information. And you can also reach out or message me through that platform.
Perfect. With that point of contact to Scott, we close the episode today. Thanks again. All the links to the book, to the websites and the multiple recommendations that Scott has provided us today will be in the description of the video and the episode. So again, thanks a lot, and I hope we can talk again soon.
I certainly hope so as well. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Expat Experts, the podcast that takes you around the world through the stories of those who've lived it. Subscribe now to YouTube and your favorite podcast platform, and stay tuned for more inspiring interviews.